Let's have a lesson and discussion on this work. Follow the lesson for free and just pick up all the tips from the video. But if you're interested, I do have a sheet music edition of all 25 etudes in Carcassi's Op.60, and there's a link for that in the description. So etude number 12, kind of like etude number 10, is very uniform in texture from start to finish. And so we have a real opportunity here to work on our technique in a musical setting and do it, in a very didactic way from start to finish. Making the study very beneficial to students, but also enjoyable as well. So in this particular study, we have arpeggios, and along with shifting chord shapes. So it's kind of a study in arpeggios, but it's also a study in shifting, that chord management, chord shape management and shifting, but also with a little bit of melodic contour in unexpected places. So let's just talk about that. Let's talk about this texture a little bit. So we have the arpeggios, right? So we have a pure arpeggio format in our right hand to work on, which is usually fingered with thumb, M, I, thumb, I, M, thumb, M, I, thumb, thumb. Occasionally we can throw an A if the spacing is wide. Now, I think on one level, the bass guides you through the piece. It's a very helpful guide, but it's not necessarily the melodic focus. But certainly, throughout the whole piece, that it very much helps you guide those arpeggios in a musical fashion. So focusing on that a little bit is very helpful. Just focusing on doing it smoothly, not worrying about it as too importantly as a melodic drive to the piece. Because we also have another aspect of the piece. The upper voice in this piece might not seem, because it occurs on an offbeat, might not seem super important, but there are times when it really does get highlighted. If we play just that upper voice, like the D, E, F sharp, G. So yes, it's a melodic line, but that doesn't make it, super important. All the voices in the arpeggio could be thought of in that way. But the difference occurs is when he uses it as a suspension. So for example, in measure 5, here, that suspension, that B is a non-chord tone, and then it resolves. Tension, release, or resolution. When those suspensions occur, it really draws a lot of attention to that upper voice that's hidden within the melody. So you have a little bit of duality here, that the bass might be the thing that is structurally going to hold you through the whole piece, especially when the upper voice isn't doing anything particularly interesting. Like in a few spots, it just repeats B for like measure 7, for example, it just plays that B over and over and over. So the bass, is really driving you through the piece, especially in measure 7. along with his crescendos. That's really driving you forward, giving you momentum and direction in the work. But sometimes that upper line just has a lot of melodic interest to it because of the way he uses it. So my recommendation is that you focus on the thumb and the M finger, and you let the thumb guide you, but you watch for opportunities to make sure that the M finger comes out and that voice gets a little bit of prominence, so that when he does do something interesting with it, it is noticed, and that if people decide to listen to that D, E, F, G, A, that they can. And then that suspension. Does it again. He has another suspension there with that A7 chord going into the D chord. So at the cadences, it also becomes quite noticeable. And when he finishes off like the sections, he finally gives us that upper melodic note as the finisher, right? Which drives even further attention towards it as being something that was constant and then gets highlighted as in the finish. So that's your challenge. You have this arpeggio texture, but you have some melodic material within that texture that can really guide you in this piece. He also has quite a bit of dynamics in this work, which I think you can observe just by pulling the microscope out and just seeing those dynamics, and you can use them, but you don't have, I wouldn't be too strict. Just use them as general phrase indicators. Besides that, I think we should just do a small walkthrough of the piece to talk about any oddities. But really, this piece is going to be partly about chord management as well. So when you're practicing the piece, feel free to practice it with those melodic ideas in mind, but also as chord shapes. Obviously, your knowledge of those chord shapes is going to be very, very important. When you actually go to perform the piece, you'll want to just get that bass note first. Bass, 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 and then whatever other notes you need can come after your bass note, right? Because you need to connect that in a legato fashion from one chord shape connected to the next note that occurs, and then get the rest of the chord as you connect in that fashion. Nevertheless, practicing it in block chord shapes can help your left hand, just muscle memory wise, recognize the shapes you need to know for this piece, and that's very useful to get down. So you can practice it in those two different ways, block chords and separately, making sure that you always connect that next bass note in order to connect each chord to the next in a legato fashion. So let's just go through it. There's lots of bar chords, but because of that connecting fashion, you can really mainly focus on getting that bass note first. Watch for those suspensions here. So that da da. Here I use PA, I mark that in the score, just because it's a reach out. Then I switch back to M immediately. What did I do there? Oh, I just repeated chord. Bar 7. Then soften it up and do a little rit. I highlight that note by muting out the rest of the notes to finally give that upper voice its clear prominence. Measure 9. If you find that difficult, just make sure your hand is aligned, because if it isn't, it's impossible to reach. But if your hand is aligned properly, it's very easy to reach. You can reach far beyond it. So just swing that hand around and have it in a good position. part of suspension, but it's a melodic interest, right? That upper line just gets so interesting sometimes. But then here, it's like the shifting harmonies and the bass becomes very important. Some interesting little chromatic shifts there. I don't know if Carcassi plays the end of the piece in upper position. He didn't mark it. I do, because I think, you know, you're here. You could shift down and then do a whole bunch of changes, but then you have to get up there in the end anyway. So I think after this chord, play the A here. That way, everything is there. And again, I mute with my finger there to highlight that final note. Really interesting piece. And when you first go to play it, you might think, oh, it's just an arpeggio study. But there's so much melodic activity in it, actually, both in the bass and the upper voice. But really, that hidden upper voice is kind of the key to this piece. As you pick up tempo, it's harder to do that, and I find that difficult. As I go faster, I find it quite difficult to highlight that melodic material really nicely. At slow tempos, I can do it, you know, quite nicely. I can really, like, you know, do those suspensions and resolutions in a very beautiful way. At faster tempos, it gets a little bit more challenging to subtly bring that out in the mix of all this flurry of activity. So I chose a pretty moderate tempo there. I know lots of people play it a little bit faster. It does say Andante here, so I think he's indicating not too quick. It shouldn't be too flashy. And yet, you do want to travel through the piece and let that melodic material come out, because in order to connect those notes across the arpeggios, there has to be some tempo to help you do that. So you can experiment with that, but make it really musical at slow tempos, and then as you raise your tempos, you can make it more exciting and go through the material in a more flowing way, but you have to retain some of that beautiful musicality.